This short video will go over the Church Cantata, not in a whole lot of detail because there's a Craig Wright lecture that covers it. I just want to touch on some of the vocabulary associated with the cantata. First of all, when you see the word cantata, it should look familiar because back in chapter 11, there was a piece by Barbara Strozzi. It was an example of a chamber cantata. When you see the word cantata, it comes from the word cantare, which means to sing. That would be opposed to sonata, which comes from suonare, which means to play or to sound. So cantata is a vocal piece. Bach wrote hundreds of these for the Lutheran Church. Lutheranism was transmitted in the Bach family for generations and accepted with deep conviction. Back in the Reformation, it was suggested that each person had the right to confront God directly in their own private form of worship. At that time, Protestant churches held worship services in their regional language, not Latin. So even though we're later in history, you're going to be hearing sacred music in German. As you've seen in chapter 12, Bach wrote many different types of compositions, and here at the end of chapter 12, we're going to listen to a few excerpts from the Church Cantata. He actually didn't write any operas, and you might be surprised because parts of it sound kind of operatic, but its function was to be church music, even though some of the movement names are the same as you'd find in an opera. Here's the definition for the Church Cantata. These were multi-movement sacred works, including arias, ariosos, and recitatives. Those words should sound familiar because we heard them in Orfeo by Monteverdi, his opera. So this is a multi-movement sacred work including arias, ariosos, and recitatives performed by vocal soloists, a chorus, and a small orchestra. Maybe some of you were lucky enough to hear the New Mexico Philharmonic's recent performance of this. Remember, back in the Renaissance and Middle Ages, composers that wrote music for the church, the Roman Catholic Church, would use Gregorian chant or something pre-composed as a foundation for their music. What Bach did was he used the chorales, which were hymns. The chorales were spiritual melodies or religious folk songs of the Lutheran Church. The chorale tunes in Bach's time were either composed earlier in the 16th and 17th centuries or had been adapted from folk tunes or Catholic hymns. They're not unlike today in that the congregation was familiar with the tunes. Probably the best example that I can think of would be Amazing Grace. The hymns carry religious connotations, many times offering comfort. Congregational singing was and still is a way for people to participate directly in the service. The piece that we have is called Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme. This translates as sleepers awake or awake, a voice is calling us. This was written while Bach was in Leipzig for the 27th Sunday after Trinity. It's based on a Lutheran chorale by a German pastor and composer named Philipp Nicolai. There are 3 stanzas to this chorale, and Bach uses the chorale in the 1st, 4th, and 7th movements. Those are the movements that you have. The text is based on Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish virgins, found in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. The 27th day after Trinity was a rare occurrence in the Lutheran calendar, and apparently it only appeared twice in the more than 2.5 decades that Bach was in Leipzig. And because of this, he was able to write this piece on a much grander scale than he might otherwise have been able to. This slide shows you that this work is made up of 7 movements. These pieces really weren't that long. They would last up to about a half hour. This is about a 25-minute work. And again, only the 1st, 4th, and 7th movements use that pre-composed chorale. The 2nd movement and the 5th movement are pretty short recitatives that lead into duets in the following movements. I labeled them as arias, but they're actually, duet because there's 2 solo singers. Okay, these are ways that Bach musically treated the chorale. In the 1st movement, it's really the most complicated because he has these different layers that are going on simultaneously. For that reason, I recommend that you go to the seventh movement first, because that one is the most straightforward out of the three different versions. The seventh movement gives us the chorale tune, and what Bach did is he took the tune and he harmonized it. In other words, it is a homophonic setting of the precomposed tune. The first movement, as I mentioned, is the most complex. It's for chorus and orchestra, and it consists of 3 layers of sound. In the choral text of this first movement, watchmen on the towers of Jerusalem call on the wise virgins, the Christians, to awake because the bridegroom is coming. The movement opens with an orchestral ritornello that may suggest a procession or march. You can hear the dotted rhythms. The first layer is the chorale tune, and it's presented in fragments in the soprano voices. The second layer is the imitative dialogue in the shorter note values in the lower voices, and the third layer is the orchestra playing motives from the ritornello. You might want to listen to the first movement a few times. The second movement is a secco recitative, only accompanied by basso continuo. You don't have that on your recording, but you can listen to the whole thing because I did put it in the online discussion. There's a link to the whole piece. Anyway, the second movement is in a minor key. The short recitative leads into the third movement, which is a duet for soprano, the sol, and bass, a bass singer who represents Christ. This movement really conveys a sense of longing. This movement, as well as the sixth, would be appropriate for a love scene in a Baroque opera, and they show that Bach didn't take his contract literally. The author for these texts is unknown and are based on the Song of Songs or Solomon's Song in the Bible. The fourth movement you do have, and it's a tenor chorale, and it's the most famous music. Here the chorale tune returns, sung by the tenors in unison, set against a newly composed contrasting melody in the orchestra. Your ears can focus on the faster moving rhythms of the string melody, and then on the sturdier, slower rhythms of the chorale tune, and then on all lines at once. This fourth movement uses a walking bass line. You heard this in Corelli's music as well. This is a bass that moves at a moderate, steady pace, mostly in equal note values and often stepwise up or down the scale. Perhaps the steadiness depicts the steadiness of Christ or his steady approach. The fifth movement is a recitative. Here it's an accompanied recitative, as the singer is accompanied by strings as well as the basso continuo. The sixth movement is another duet for soprano and bass. The seventh movement is the shortest because it's homophonic. This ends the cantata, as Bach usually did, by taking the precomposed chorale and just giving it a homophonic setting. It really then gives prominence to the words. Okay, listen to the 3 movements that you have, preferably listen to the whole piece, and there you will have heard a gem among the compositions that Bach wrote.